As the story begins, she tries to sit down on an airplane despite being pregnant and exhausted. However, her attempts are disrupted when the flight attendant kicks her off. What happens next completely flips the script. As her husband turns out to be someone else entirely, everything changes when the truth is revealed. The passengers were starting to settle into their seats on the Boston to Los Angeles flight, which was scheduled to take off in less than an hour. It was just another ordinary afternoon at the airport. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching today. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe for more. Among them was a pregnant lady in her late 20s who was clearly experiencing the effects of her lengthy voyage. She struggled to locate her seat, and even once she found, wasn't sure it was the correct one. A flight attendant had been diligently monitoring the flight attendant. A woman in her early 30s was already under a lot of stress due to the flight's late departure and her extensive to-do list. She swiftly glanced at the seating chart and assumed the pilot would be in charge of the safety of the passengers. However, the interaction between the two parties did not go according to plan. The woman had inadvertently taken the wrong seat, and the flight attendant was quite impatient when she asked her to get up. The pregnant woman, who was visibly tired and uneasy, tried to explain that she was in the correct seat, but she was still feeling a bit overwhelmed. However, the attendant wasn't paying attention. The flight attendant's voice was harsh, and the lady, clutching her stomach, attempted to produce the ticket with quivering hands. The situation became even more chaotic as the people surrounding them began to notice the mounting tension, but no one intervened to alleviate the flight attendant's frustration. Again, the pregnant woman's voice grew louder as she threatened to ask the other passengers to exit the plane unless they moved. The woman slowly stood up, her face red with shame. She had been on numerous flights before and never had anyone treated her this way. She attempted to speak, but her words fell on deaf ears, became entangled in the escalating mayhem, her mind racing with concerns about boarding the plane, particularly given her pregnancy and the fact that she was alone. The flight attendant's demeanor had exacerbated her anxiety, and the whispers from other passengers had grown louder, yet no one had come to her rescue. The pregnant woman begged the flight attendant, her voice quivering, to let her sit down and rest, but the attendant was adamant, her patience wearing thin. Eventually the attendant snapped as the tension in the cabin increased. She made a decision that would soon spiral out of her control, so she retreated. With a more determined expression, she stared at the pregnant woman again and warned, "If you don't get off the plane now, I'll have to contact security." The woman's heart was racing, and she realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was becoming a serious issue. Passengers around them began to whisper. It was clear that some people were uncomfortable, and a few of them even gave the flight attendant disapproving looks. However, nobody got up to assist the pregnant woman, who stood there with her hands on her large belly, confused about what to do. She felt ashamed, exposed, and completely alone among all these strangers who didn't care about her plight. As the flight attendant was about to summon security, the door to the cabin swung open, revealing a man in a sharp suit. She couldn't understand why the situation had intensified so rapidly. All she wanted was to settle in for the flight and relax. Entering the room, his piercing gaze quickly swept over the pregnant lady. Without hesitating, he rushed up to her and spoke the words, "Excuse me," in a voice that was both calm and forceful. He was tall, in his late 30s, and had an air of authority that turned heads. Was there an issue? It appeared as though his inquiries caught everyone unawares, particularly the flight attendant. She glanced at him, perplexed, but before she could answer, the man turned to the pregnant woman, grinned, and asked in a low voice, "Is everything okay?" The flight attendant, still flustered, opened her mouth to speak, but she swiftly shut it. Disturbed, the pregnant woman, who had been too shocked to speak until then, finally looked up at him in relief as he added, "This is my wife." The man's words carried a weight that changed the atmosphere instantly. The flight attendant blinked, clearly taken aback. She had no notion who she was dealing with. Overwhelmed by emotion, she pleaded with the guy to leave the aircraft in a barely audible voice. The man's visage became icy as he replied, "You've just told my wife to leave the plane." The flight attendant, who was clearly anxious and on the verge of fainting, stood up straight, reached for her mouth to explain, but nothing came out. She knew she had made a huge error, but her nerves were getting the best of her. The man's steady gaze only served to heighten her sense of helplessness as she cast her eyes about the cabin, perhaps seeking solace from her fellow travelers. However, no one responded. The whispers ceased and all eyes were fixed on her. "I apologize, but there seems to have been some miscommunication over the trip." The attendant stumbled over her words, and I thought she was in the wrong seat. Suddenly, a man spoke up, his voice barely audible but authoritative enough to silence the room. The tension in the air seemed like it could be sliced with a knife. He then returned his attention to the woman, asking in a concerned tone, "Are you okay?" The flight attendant's voice became more steady as the pregnant woman, whose face remained pale from stress, said, "I'm just trying to sit and rest." Her hands were trembling as she clutched her bag, but she was beginning to regain some composure. Sensing that things were spiraling out of her hands, the flight attendant quickly retreated to the front of the plane and whispered something along the lines of, "I need to consult with the captain." I don't know why she rushed to conclusions so quickly. I felt ashamed and exposed as I saw the pregnant lady nod in response to the man's repeated concerns for their well-being on the aircraft. She mumbled something under her breath rather than speaking to her husband, who was now clearly upset. Her husband sighed quietly and looked forward to the front of the aircraft, where the flight attendant was chatting with the captain. A few of passengers, picking up on the mounting tension, had taken out their phones, and the air was thick with uncomfortable quiet. After a few minutes, the flight attendant and captain made their way back to the aisle, and the captain fixed his gaze squarely on the guy. "Excuse me, sir, for the confusion." The captain seemed unusually composed, but there was an obvious undercurrent of anxiety in his voice. "We must urgently settle this matter. It seems that there was a problem with the seating arrangement." The man's face was... The pregnant lady, who was even more bewildered than before, glanced between the two men, wondering whether things were becoming worse or better. His statements left no room for dispute, and it was evident he wasn't interested in excuses. Would either de-escalate or become even more tense. The captain surprised everyone by turning to the flight attendant and asking in an unfriendly tone, "Do you know who this passenger is?" The question lingered in the air, and the flight continued as planned. The flight attendant's complexion became pale as she started to comprehend that the guy standing next to the pregnant lady was no common traveler, but rather a somebody whose very presence demanded respect. Until now, she had no clue who he was, but she was about to discover his identity. Her face flushed a deep red as the captain's words slammed into her. Attempting to process what had just been said, she glanced at the man standing next to the pregnant woman. She had been preoccupied with enforcing rules and managing her own stress, completely oblivious to the people she was dealing with. Now the uncomfortable truth hit her. She had no idea. The captain, who remained positioned at the front of the aircraft, observed the flight attendant's response intently. He silently introduced himself as Mr. Porter and seemed to emphasize the gravity of the situation. As his words reverberated throughout the cabin, the flight attendant's jaw dropped and her mouth went dry. He was the CEO of Porter IT, a guy who had revolutionized the IT world in the last 5 years. He stopped briefly to let the name sink in. Although she was familiar with Porter Tech, as was everyone, the flight attendant's face became pale as she stuttered. "I didn't realize I was unknowingly causing the CEO to force his pregnant wife to disembark from the plane." You have humiliated my wife and made this issue much worse than it needed to be. All I meant was that I thought she was in the incorrect seat. I apologize. My mistake." Mr. Porter cut her off before she could continue. His voice was calm, but it had a biting edge. After everything that had transpired, the flight attendant felt she could say nothing to alleviate the pregnant woman's mounting embarrassment, so she finally spoke up, saying, "It's okay, really. I just want to sit down." And in an effort to calm her husband, she whispered, "Get comfy." However, Mr. Porter was having none of it and firmly said, "This has to be handled correctly. You don't treat someone like this, particularly not while pregnant." He shifted his attention back to the captain, his pupils constricting in a question about what the captain would do. The captain, who appeared visibly unsettled, glanced over at the flight attendant and said, "We will ensure that this does not happen." Again, the attendant assured him that they would upgrade their seats and take good care of them. But Mr. Porter, he continued, his voice becoming more forceful, "It's not just about upgrading seats. It's about respect. You've shown none, and now you have to answer for it." The flight attendant shuffled nervously, uncertain of how to react. The captain has seen her fair share of irate passengers, but this one was different. The mood in the cabin had changed drastically as people began to comprehend that this wasn't your average argument over seating. It was turning into a spectacle for all to see. The flight attendant sprinted off to arrange for the upgrade, while the captain rushed to calm the passengers. Mr. Porter glanced over at his wife, who had been silent during the entire exchange. He gave her a reassuring squeeze on the hand, but she remained motionless, her face a mask of regret and terror. The pregnant woman, who was still seated in her original position, attempted to relax, but the gravity of the situation overwhelmed her. He whispered to her, "Don't worry, we'll get this sorted out." But she could see he was still extremely irritated. It wasn't just about the seats, it was about how she had been handled disrespectfully and humiliatingly for no apparent reason. The captain's return, a few minutes later, altered the atmosphere in the cabin. Tension was still there, but now everyone was focused on cleaning up the chaos that had ensued. The flight attendant, who was still visibly flustered, kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. She knew she had made a huge mistake, but the weight of it was starting to hit her. Captain Porter said, "Now we've arranged for him to speak in a much more careful voice." He glanced at the flight attendant, his eyes conveying that the talk was far from finished. The attendant nodded subtly, avoiding his stare, and he promised to personally see that everything went well from here on out. The couple was promoted to first class, and their comfort was our first concern. At this point, the flight attendant was keenly aware of the power dynamics at play, but she still couldn't bring herself to speak. The public nature of the situation made her feel even more uncomfortable, and her apology seemed pointless. What had once been a minor mistake now threatened to cost her far more than "I believe this goes beyond merely an improvement, Captain." Mr. Porter took a minute to consider the offer. "Thank you," and then responded calmly, his voice losing the warmth it had previously. As the captain coordinated the change, Mr. Porter's intense stare remained fixed on the flight attendant. He no longer displayed rage, but a far more disturbing mix of disappointment, and the pregnant lady, still obviously disturbed, turned at her husband and said, "You don't have to do all this." Her voice was soft, but her eyes revealed how profoundly the whole ordeal had affected her. He gently squeezed her hand and said, "You shouldn't have to put up with being treated like that, not by anyone. Especially not on a flight where you're supposed to feel safe and comfortable." His words were comforting, but they couldn't escape her pain. She wanted nothing more than to escape the embarrassment that had enveloped her. She was afraid her husband would be discovered, and she desperately wanted peace. However, the more she pondered the matter, The more furious she grew at the treatment she had endured. She was pregnant, and all she had wished for was a quiet escape. As the captain left to arrange the seat swap, the flight attendant stood still, her hands quivering slightly. She was unsure of what would happen next. It seemed like everyone was watching and judging her. The flight attendant's job was at stake. Would the company discipline her? The prospect of such action sickened her. Meanwhile, the passengers who had been chatting amongst themselves fell silent as they observed the interaction play out. Some had even recorded it on their phones. Their expressions of concern were plain to see, would be etched in memory for a long time. The tension was still high, and when Mr. Porter leaned in to talk to his wife, his comments were brief but decisive. "Let us not squander any more time. We are leaving this place." Strolling awkwardly to one side, the flight attendants, including the one responsible for the whole incident, appeared to be waiting for something. Whether it was an apology, an explanation, or even just a moment of calm, as Mr. Porter assisted his wife to stand up from her seat. Mr. Porter escorted his wife to the front of the plane, where the captain was still attempting to resolve conflicts with the crew. He walked purposefully, his steps deliberate and steady, in sharp contrast to the mayhem that had broken out moments before, and his wife appeared to be slightly more composed. As if to ground herself in the midst of everything that had just transpired, the pregnant woman clutched his hand tightly as she followed him. The flight attendants hurriedly cleared the way for them, but no one looked at each other. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and everyone could feel it. As Mr. Porter and his wife approached the front, she gave a quick look around. Some people were watching intently, while others appeared more interested in taking pictures or videos than paying attention. She could hear quiet whispers, some of which sounded sympathetic, and others that seemed more curious than worried. The captain walked over to them and apologized again, saying, "I'm really sorry for the trouble." His voice was courteous but strained as he assured them that everything would be taken care of from now on. Mr. Porter didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at, "I don't believe I've ever seen you so unhappy," the captain whispered to his wife. His words were sweet, intended to calm her, but there was a biting edge to his voice when he added, "And I don't think I've ever." Mr. Porter's countenance tightened as his wife distantly gazed at him as he gripped her hand. "It's not your fault," she said, her voice quivering. "I just don't understand why she would treat me like that. I don't care why this has escalated. What matters is that no one deserves this, including you, and I will ensure that this kind of conduct is not tolerated." The pregnant lady nodded in agreement, but she secretly wished the situation would simply go away. She tried to put it in the past and concentrate on their upcoming trip to Los Angeles, but her husband wasn't going to let it go. He had a quiet but forceful way of handling situations like this, so there was no room for misunderstanding. As he turned back to the captain, Mr. Porter's voice became firm. The captain nodded slightly as he understood the seriousness of the situation. "I felt it was imperative that the flight attendant who had made my wife feel worthless be held accountable. No one should ever have to endure such treatment, particularly when pregnant and traveling alone." Mr. Porter nodded and then turned to guide his wife to their new seats in first class. Suddenly, a flight attendant with a pale face and an apparent desire to apologize ran up to them, but she refrained from doing so. She looked up at Mr. Porter, her voice quivering, and said, "I'm sorry for what happened. I didn't intend to hurt anyone. It was my mistake. I'll do everything I can to make it right." At first, Mr. Porter didn't respond. "I'm sure it wasn't deliberate, but the harm has been done." He merely gazed at her, his eyes icy and calculated. He had no intention of forgiving her immediately and didn't believe she deserved it. On the other hand, he didn't want to make a public spectacle of her either. Mr. Porter remained silent, but his actions spoke louder than words. He assisted his wife, and the flight attendant nodded in agreement. her face showing signs of increasing anxiety. She was obviously unprepared for this kind of confrontation, and she could feel the weight of the moment. As they took their seats in first class, the flight attendant swiftly moved aside to make room for them. The pregnant woman closed her eyes and breathed deeply, hoping for a peaceful flight to alleviate the stress of her pregnancy. What she hadn't anticipated, though, was the storm that had... Just as the plane was about to touch down in Los Angeles, the pregnant woman sat back in her seat, her mind racing with the events of the last hour. It was as if she had been caught in a surreal dream, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the aftermath of this incident was only just starting. In the midst of her nightmare, she never dreamed that something as mundane as boarding a flight would turn into such a whirlwind of disorder. The steady hum of the plane's engines made the anxiety nearly go away, but it remained heavy and oppressive. Mr. Porter sat silently, his hand gently resting on hers arm. He hadn't uttered a word since they took our seats in first class, and she could tell he was thinking deeply. She could almost taste the rage building up beneath his composed exterior. He was usually a quiet, collected man, but this had triggered an emotion he wasn't ready to let go of. She broke the pause and added, "I don't know what I would have done without you." Her voice was kind and almost apologetic, as if she was sorry for the inconvenience this had caused. Mr. Porter looked to her, his gaze softening. "You did nothing wrong. I simply wanted a peaceful moment with you. You were just trying to sit down and relax. No one should treat you that way." His voice was firm but carried an undercurrent of concern. His protective instincts had kicked in the moment he saw her distressed, and they hadn't stopped since she nodded. Mr. Porter reached out and delicately cupped her cheek in his palm as she stumbled over her words, unable to convey the overwhelming sense of embarrassment, uncertainty, and abrupt change in her life. Even though it had been a long day, the worst is behind us now that we're in first class and secure. The pregnant lady tried to smile, but her eyelids remained closed. The flight attendant's icy dismissal lingered in her thoughts. It wasn't simply the mistake, it was also the inconsiderate treatment she had received, which made it difficult for her to move on. The flight attendants who had been tending to the cabin kept nervously looking in her direction as they went about their duties, but she felt like an inconvenience every time they passed. As if waiting for some sort of judgment from Mr. Porter, they exchanged anxious looks. She couldn't help but notice how the dynamics had changed in the cabin. Before, she had been merely a passenger, but now she was something else entirely. The once tranquil, subdued atmosphere surrounding her was now charged with tension, as if anticipating the inevitable. She moved around in her seat, fiddling with the blanket draped over her. The first-class service was impeccable, and for the first time since boarding, she let herself feel a sliver of solace. After all, she wasn't being asked to leave anymore. Mr. Porter, sensing her unease, reached into his bag and pulled out his phone. He didn't look at it immediately, but she knew what he was thinking. Comfort faded as the incident replayed in her mind, each time with more details and moments she wished had gone differently. He was on the verge of making a call that would most certainly make things worse. The thought of him contacting airline executives and demanding answers made her feel uneasy, but she couldn't hold it against him. After all, it was she, not he, who had been treated like a second-class passenger. She whispered to him, "I just want to get to Los Angeles without any more trouble. You've been treated poorly and it needs to be addressed. You deserve to be treated with respect. If I don't do this, you'll be embarrassed." Mr. Porter met her gaze, his expression serious. Knowing he was correct, she groaned, not wanting to add fuel to the fire. Being in the limelight wasn't her cup of tea, and now that the whole airline had watched, there appeared to be no getting away from it. The flight attendants' anxious looks indicated that they were aware of the error and its possible consequences. After what seemed like an eternity, Mr. Porter eventually glanced at his phone. scrolling through the texts that had arrived throughout the experience. Among the many emails and messages he received from his business connections throughout the trip, one from an airline executive struck out. The message was an apology, but he felt it fell short since the words were too general and failed to address the underlying problem. How his wife had been treated like an issue rather than a paying customer. He swiftly typed out a response. "I anticipate a call from your CEO upon our arrival. This matter cannot be ignored." The pregnant woman observed him with a blend of admiration and concern, and she comprehended why. As they continued their ride into the air, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of remorse. She didn't want to draw attention to herself, but she also understood that this wasn't about her anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had. Felt like it was getting heavier, not just from the present moment, but from the weight of what was to come. There was no going back. This incident would set in motion a series of events that neither of them could have foreseen. As the planes flew through the sky, they were both aware that this was about more than just a bad flight. It was about the rest of the flight seemed to blur as the pregnant woman, her gaze sporadically glancing at her husband, attempted to settle into the comfort of her first-class seat. But she couldn't escape the unsettling sensation that everything around her was changing, heading in a direction she wasn't expecting. She had hoped to take this flight to relax and escape the grind before her pregnancy's last weeks, but instead she found herself entangled in a complex situation that she hadn't asked for. The more she considered it, the less interested she was in being involved. Meanwhile, her husband appeared more distant, and with each passing minute, he sent out 2 more emails and made a couple of calls. Despite keeping his composure, she could sense the growing resolve within him. She knew he was serious about conveying the gravity of the situation to the flight attendants and the airline. The pregnant woman felt a twinge of dread, even though he meant to fix the situation. The fallout was coming, and she wasn't sure she was prepared. Leaning back, she glanced out the window at the clouds below. The sight was soothing, but her mind was anything but. Recalled the incident when the flight attendant had insisted she exit the plane, her words resonating, the misunderstanding over the seat wasn't the only thing that hurt. The flight attendant's treatment of her as though she were a burden and an annoyance also contributed. The feeling of being ignored and dehumanized lingered. He questioned her throughout the trip, his voice firm but with an undercurrent of worry. She nodded, though she wasn't fully certain it was true. "I'm fine," she said, but the words hung awkwardly in her throat. The humiliation of the situation had permeated every part of her mind, leaving her feeling empty and hollow. No matter how comfortable the seat was, or how much better she felt now that she was out of the cramped middle seat, the knot in her stomach wouldn't go away. He spoke softly, his eyes firm, and said, "You don't have to pretend. I'll handle this." She could feel his determination and the depth of his indignation at the injustice of what had happened to her. Her admiration for his quiet strength and his unwavering support for those he cared about was heightened when it seemed like his struggle was not solely about him, but for her as well. Despite her admiration, she couldn't shake the pang of guilt. She hoped he wouldn't cause any trouble for her sake, and she certainly didn't want him to. She whispered, "It's only a mistake, a misunderstanding. We're in first class now. Maybe we can just let it go." He shook his head, his jaw hard. This wasn't about a mistake. It was about causing friction between a whole airline. No one should have treated you that way. You deserve respect, not to be embarrassed over something as insignificant as that. His voice was firm, but there was a subtle tenderness and protectiveness that she couldn't ignore. His words struck her more strongly than she had anticipated. She had hoped to move on, to find a way to put the incident in the past, but his words caused her to pause. She didn't want to make a big deal out of something that wasn't significant, but his words brought to light the bigger picture. What stung the most was the realization that what had occurred wasn't just an innocent mistake. Rather, it was based on disrespect and the idea that she wasn't important enough to warrant attention. She leaned back against her husband as he spoke softly, his tone softening as he put a hand over hers. "You didn't ask for any of this," he said, explaining that the issue had been created by someone else. "Take a seat." She was able to calm down a bit, but her thoughts were still racing. The flight attendant's eyes would occasionally linger on her, but now they seemed more wary, almost sorry. It was hard to ignore the change in the room compared to when they had been. No longer were the flight attendants completely oblivious to the needs of their passengers. Now a palpable sense of dread pervaded the atmosphere. The pregnant woman couldn't help but take some solace in the fact that the flight attendants were understandably anxious, and perhaps, as the plane drew to a close, Mr. Porter glanced at his phone for one last time. He and his companion had witnessed a moment when their conduct had crossed a line, and they were aware of it. What had begun as a minor misunderstanding had escalated into something much larger, and it was clear that it would stick with them even after they arrived at their destination. As he read through additional messages, his jaw tightened. The airline had previously contacted him, apologizing in a company-wide statement that he had been shared with. However, he still felt that it wasn't enough. He typed rapidly, his fingers gliding over the keyboard. He firmly said, "I expect a personal call from your CEO once we land. I'll be waiting at the gate." His wife peered at him, her face ambiguous. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" The fight, as unpleasant as it had been, was far from over. The remainder of the flight was peaceful, with only the sound of the engines, but as the plane landed and the seatbelt sign went out, she took a deep breath, knowing that he wouldn't back down. The plane touched down with a gentle thud as its wheels touched the runway. The landing was smooth, but for the pregnant woman, every moment felt heavier than the last. As they stepped off the plane, they both knew their story would not fade into the background. The consequences of what had happened were only just beginning to unfold. As the plane drew near the gate, she peered out the window and watched the lights of Los Angeles sink into the horizon. A fresh chapter in her life was about to begin, but for the moment, all she could focus on was the storm that had formed in the middle of the flight. The events of the previous few hours had done more than disrupt her. As the aircraft descended, her husband, who remained engrossed in his phone, composed a few more messages. His reaction to the situation had become robotic, consisting of sending texts to his lawyer, business contacts, and, most importantly, a few high-ranking executives at the airline. He was determined not to let this matter fade away. The overwhelming sense of injustice he experienced was too great to ignore, and it pertained not only to him, but also to the treatment of his wife. He understood the necessity of holding these individuals responsible, and he was determined to do so regardless of the time and effort it required. He eventually looked up from his phone and said, "Are you okay?" She turned to him, her emotions clearly visible, and she smiled weakly. "I don't know if I'll ever be okay after all this," she said, her words seeming weird but real. "There is just so much, and it seems like the flight is irrelevant now. What matters is the way she treated me and how I was dismissed." Mr. Porter nodded, his face turning gloomy as he hung up the phone. "I agree. What matters is a deeper issue. How some people think they can treat others badly. Nobody deserves to be treated that way." She exhaled, her emotions pulsating between relief and overwhelm at the weight of his words. She had always been one to shy away from confrontation, preferring to let minor issues fade into the background. However, this was no minor matter. It pertained to her dignity, her rights as a paying customer, and the absence of— She spoke softly. "I don't want to be in the headlines or have anyone think we're just making this a drama." Mr. Porter leaned in, his voice quiet but resolute, telling her that it's not about making a spectacle out of her pregnancy. "I will not let this slip. My focus is not just on what occurred on this aircraft, but also on the potential consequences for anybody who treats others with such contempt. She stared at him, with her chest protruding, and she was determined to see that it wouldn't happen again. He was absolutely correct. He wasn't acting for the limelight. He was simply doing what was right. However, the prospect of this becoming more public and widespread unsettled her. She wasn't the type to enjoy having her attention drawn to anything, especially after what she had experienced emotionally. Feeling exposed and vulnerable, the jet eventually touched down at the gate. Passengers started to grab their bags, and the cabin became more busier as people got ready to exit. The pregnant lady could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air. She got to her feet, and with her husband by her side, they made their way down the aisle. As they went past the flight attendants, she could feel their scrutiny. The flight attendants weren't as visibly hostile as before, but they were still nervous and aware of the storm they had contributed to. Despite this, they avoided making eye contact with her. As she strolled by, but she couldn't help but notice a subtle change in their demeanor as they approached the gate. Mr. Porter's phone started buzzing again, this time with an official apology and a request for a private meeting once they landed. However, he was sick of emails, sick of polite apologies. With a steady voice, he told his wife, "I will make sure they understand exactly what happened, and I will make it clear that this isn't over until I am satisfied with their—" After she had been humiliated and refused to let the situation drag on for days, while they fumbled through vague gestures of regret. She nodded in agreement, even though she was still on the fence about whether or not to bring up the subject. She knew her husband wouldn't back down from a strong belief, and she wasn't sure she had the emotional energy to handle the coming conversation. The pregnant lady felt a part of her exposed as she watched the people around them more intently on the way to the meeting spot at the airport. There were whispers, occasional looks, and hushed discussions, and she felt like everyone could see what had occurred, even though no one could, passing by her peripheral vision, but still influencing her thoughts. Those around her remained in the dark about the specifics, but she had the uneasy feeling that everyone knew what had happened, the scene, the confrontation. It had all taken on a life of its own. Eventually, they made it to a tiny conference room. Inside the airfield office, 2 executives were patiently waiting for their turn. The room had an air of professionalism, with its immaculate white walls and massive conference table. The moment they stepped foot in the room, the vibe changed. It was both more formal and more heated. With their expressions contrite and remorseful, Mr. Porter's wife stood by his side and felt an instant unease. It wasn't only that the apology appeared contrived, she also sensed that this had transformed from a casual chat into something more formal. The room fell into a frigid stillness as the door slammed shut, leaving the pregnant woman and her husband facing the 2 airline executives seated at the table. The executives, a middle-aged man and a woman in their early 40s, appeared anything but calm and collected. As they attempted to keep their composure in the face of mounting client complaints, it became clear that this was no ordinary situation. Rather, it had quickly become out of hand. The room was stark and uninviting, with only a glass of water and a few notepads scattered across the desk. The executives flashed half-smiles and motioned for the pair to take a seat, but neither Mr. Porter nor his wife budged. They weren't here for small talk. They were here to make sure that what had occurred would be remembered. Mr. Porter inhaled deeply, his posture poised and authoritative. His wife, who had been humiliated by a flight attendant who was only doing her job, believed that this was no longer an inconvenience or an error. Now, it was about holding herself accountable and making sure no one else felt the same way. It was more than that. It was also a matter of authority, dignity, and respect. And it was obvious to Mr. Porter that the airline hadn't really grasped the seriousness of the situation up to this point. The executives looked at one another, and then the guy. One of the men, who seemed to be older, cleared his throat and leaned forward ever so slightly. "Mr. and Mrs. Porter, first and foremost, I would like to convey our profoundest apologies for the incident that occurred on your flight today. This was without a doubt an error on our side, and we very much regret the misery it caused." His tone was measured but obviously strained. He seemed to be reading from a script while attempting to sound sincere, but to the pregnant woman, it came across as completely contrived. The apology sounded like something the airline had prepared, and the words seemed overly scripted. It was clear that Mr. Porter's response was not based on genuine regret or understanding. He flinched and avoided eye contact with the executives as he said, "This wasn't a mistake. This was an attitude problem. There was a complete lack of respect for my wife's dignity. We wouldn't be in this situation now if it had been handled correctly from the beginning." His voice was steady, but there was an obvious edge to it. The pregnant woman could feel the tension in his words, and the room seemed to shrink as he finished with courteous corporate apologies. Words without deeds. The time had come for action. The previously quiet female executive shifted uneasily in her chair, looking across at her colleague. "We understand," she said, "that Mr. Porter and we take full responsibility as the flight attendant. We have already talked to the relevant parties and are doing an internal assessment to prevent a recurrence of this issue. However, this was insufficient. The pregnant lady could feel her husband's impatience building alongside her, and he was not seeking reviews or promises of improvement. Future improvements were important to him, as were concrete actions and responsibility. He needed assurance that his wife's and his situation would not be ignored." "What does that mean?" Mr. Porter inquired, his voice composed but filled with concern. "There seems to be an underlying tension. What sort of consequences can we expect? Will a review resolve the issues that have already been raised? Will a written apology alleviate my wife's feelings of humiliation and shame? I can assure you it will not." The executives engaged in another round of back and forth. "Mr. Porter, I want you to know that our company takes customer satisfaction very seriously. The flight attendant in issue is now on leave until a thorough investigation is completed. We will make sure that this type of thing doesn't happen again. My wife was the one who was publicly humiliated, and Mr. Porter's remedy was to remove her from the schedule for a few days." He repeated his narrowed eyes and said it was their solution. The pregnant lady had a wave of aggravation as she was made to feel like the issue. She had hoped to avoid becoming involved in the drama, but now, listening to the impersonal comments from the corporation, she felt that old knot in her stomach again. She had been ignored. By an airline employee, sure, but this wasn't about a single error. It was about a systematic problem, the insensitivity and callousness toward consumers. It was about how quickly someone may be disregarded due to an oversight, or we apologize for any confusion, Mr. Porter. The female executive did mention that her voice was slightly shaking. "Rest assured, we are taking this matter very seriously and will not let it go unchecked. If you would like, we can schedule a separate meeting with senior management at a later time. You think having a private conversation will make my wife feel better about what happened on that plane? Once the full investigation is over, Mr. Porter should resign. This isn't about holding private meetings. It's about making it right now. Emphasizing the importance of customers and treating them with respect is crucial. It is disheartening to see pregnant women treated like second-class passengers." As she observed her husband's exchange with the executives, she could sense their growing frustration. There was more to him than met the eye. She sensed a subtle power in his resolve. And he wasn't merely fighting for her, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been discriminated against or fired due to their identity or circumstances. Struggle for her, it was a struggle for fundamental human dignity. The executives appeared to finally grasp that this wasn't a conversation they could ignore. The female executive drew closer, her gaze fixed on Mr. Porter. "We understand, sir, and we will contact you within 48 hours to follow up on your inquiry. In the meanwhile, if there's anything we can do to help you today, we are happy to lend a hand." However, the pregnant woman, overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation, felt she could no longer hold back. She spoke in a high-pitched voice. "I don't want your follow-up. I don't want your promises. I want you to look at me and understand that what happened to me wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure in empathy." The room fell silent as the she had made it plain that neither she nor her husband would back down. And for the first time throughout this entire ordeal, the executives realized they knew the battle wasn't going to be won by utilizing corporate jargon or vague apologies. As they processed her words, the room became electric with a tangible change. It wasn't just about one woman or one flight attendant. It was about preventing a recurrence of this kind of incident. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and everyone felt the weight of the moment. The words spoken by the pregnant woman had pierced through the courteous corporate facade, and for the first time since they had entered, the airline executives, appeared to be struggling to come to terms with what had transpired. It was clear that this wasn't a minor misunderstanding, but rather a systemic and philosophical problem affecting more than just one flight attendant's actions. Allowed such behavior to persist unabated, the female executive, clearly frightened, slumped back in her chair, tapping nervously on the table. The male executive, despite his best efforts to appear composed, couldn't conceal the growing anxiety on his face. I thought this meeting would be a simple opportunity to apologize and move on with the Porters. However, it became evident that this wasn't going to be that way. The look on Mr. Porter's face betrayed his determination, and he broke down in tears. The air was heavy with solemnity as he spoke with a measured, authoritative tone. "We are not here to bully you or make threats. What we want is accountability. The person who wronged my wife should feel like they actually has to face the consequences." The executives glanced at each other, uncertain of how to respond. But it was obvious that the pretense of corporate politeness wouldn't be sufficient to address Mr. Porter's request. They wanted to know, what does this mean for us right now? Or, what does this mean for anyone who has ever been treated like this? To end this conversation on a positive note, the male executive knew they needed to offer something more substantial. He cleared his throat once more and adjusted his spectacles. "You're right, Mr. Porter. The apology is just words. What we're offering, however, is a full in-person investigation. A team of external consultants will study this occurrence together with our training standards for flight attendants, and we will implement stronger measures for customer care. We appreciate that for your wife. This wasn't just about a seating mistake, it was about her dignity, and we cannot allow our staff to treat passengers this way." Mr. Porter nodded, but his expression didn't soften. "That's a start, but it's not enough. The problem isn't just about staff training. It's about the culture you've allowed to grow the flight attempt. Who made this mistake clearly felt it was right to treat my wife this way. That's an issue that goes deeper than one person. That mindset has to be destroyed. Not simply addressed. The pregnant lady, who had been silent for a while, suddenly spoke out again, her voice low, but filled with a quiet passion. "You say you'll investigate, but how long will that take? Will it be another round of corporate meetings, back and forth emails, and promises to do better? Because right now, none of that matters to me. I don't care about reports. I care about accountability. I want to know how you will make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Her words echoed in the room, leaving a palpable silence in their wake. The male executive opened his mouth, but for once he had no immediate answer. He was beginning to understand the enormity of what they were facing. This wasn't just about making a few apologies, it was about confronting a culture of indifference and entitlement that had allowed an employee to act out of line without fear of consequence. The female executive took a deep breath and spoke, her voice more measured now. "Mr. and Mrs. Porter, I hear you, and we're not just offering lip service here. We'll start by issuing a formal public apology. Not just a general statement, but one directed specifically at you and your experience. We'll make sure it's clear to our customers and employees that we do not tolerate this kind of behavior. We'll also take immediate action to suspend the flight attendant involved, pending a full review. And she will not return to her duties until we are certain she understands the seriousness of this problem. On top of that, we're willing to pay you compensation for your inconvenience. We'll cover the cost of your journey and offer extra miles and credits for future travel. But more significantly, we're determined to improving our rules and ensuring that this doesn't happen again." The pregnant woman, who had been trying to remain composed throughout the meeting, felt a mix of emotions flooding through her. On one hand, she appreciated the effort to take responsibility, but on the other, the idea of compensation and gestures of goodwill felt hollow. None of anything would alter what had occurred. The sting of shame was something that couldn't be removed by miles or credits. She glanced at her husband, quietly seeking his direction, as if wondering if this was enough. Mr. Porter was still digesting the offer. He could see the genuine effort in the executive's eyes now, but he also knew that these were just first steps. There was still work to be done, work that would take time and sustained effort. He wasn't about to let them walk out of this room with the impression that it was over. That's a step in the right direction. He said, his voice low but stern, "But let's be clear here. This is just the beginning. I'll be monitoring your progress on this. I want to see genuine improvements, not just promises, and I'm going to make sure your customers know that you're taking this seriously." The executives nodded, and for the first time their faces were a little less tense. They knew they were far from done, but the weight of the meeting had shifted. They weren't just dealing with a disgruntled customer. They were dealing with someone who was prepared to hold them accountable, no matter how high up the chain the issue went. The pregnant woman finally spoke again, her voice calmer now. "I just want you to realize it wasn't just the event. It was the sensation of being unseen. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter, and it's not something that goes away with a refund or an apology. I need to know that when I walk on board a plane next time, I won't be treated like a problem." The room was quiet for a while as the weight of her words sank in. The male executive glanced at her. His face softened. "I understand, Mrs. Porter. We will do everything in our power to make sure you—" The pregnant lady nodded slowly, still uncertain whether she could believe their statements, but something in their eyes now told her they realized the importance of the situation. "Thank you, Mr. Porter, for treating everyone with the respect they deserve." After a lengthy pause, his voice became noticeably quieter, as if he sensed that the conversation was coming to a close. He assured that he would be in touch and that he expected him to be involved in every step of the process. As the meeting drew to a close, the executive rose to his feet, evidently relieved that the confrontation had ended. Mr. and Mrs. Porter also rose to their feet, and despite the pregnant woman's desire to put everything behind her, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of relief as they made their way out of the room and toward the airport's exit. The weight of the ordeal was beginning to lift, but she knew that this wasn't the end. The pregnant lady had an unusual feeling of comfort as they strolled through the airport terminal. She hoped that this was part of a greater movement toward making the airline business more transparent and compassionate. It was one of those rare times when she grasped the power of standing out and demanding respect, but also that it was exhausting and tough. Throughout that period, she had a nagging sense of anxiety. She knew the problem wasn't over just because after their encounter, Any significant change, if any, would occur later on. As he walked by her side, her husband seemed more relaxed than he had been throughout the meeting, albeit he still had a fixed jaw. Despite his unwavering resolve, his formerly fiery eyes now exhibited a gentleness that had propelled him. He seemed to have calmed down throughout the torture, but it was obvious he wouldn't stop until he was sure "I can't believe that just happened," she said, her voice barely audible as the airline delivered on their promises. Their steps toward the exit were hushed. "I never imagined I'd have to endure anything like that." Glanced at her with a face that conveyed both calm pride and tenderness, as if he understood her plight. "Merit it. You shouldn't have felt the need to, but I'm happy that you didn't back down." She offered a weak, weary grin, "Not only to you, but to anybody else who may have been in your position. It was just intended to be a flight, and I had no idea it would grow to this size. It was supposed to be a peaceful, ordinary journey, but now I feel like I'm lugging around this whole thing, and I simply can't." He lowered his voice and reached out to grip her hand tenderly. "I could see it has been a lot, and there is yet more to come, but I will be at your side every step of the way." She gave a subtle nod, indicating that they will face whatever comes next as a team. His words were now setting in, and although she had always known he would be there for her, there was this predicament. Something about the sequence of events had caused her to comprehend the extent to which he was prepared to battle for her. It extended beyond this particular episode and pertained to his perception of her perception of him was based on his intransigence when confronted with wrongdoing. He was unforgiving when it came to his sense of justice, and that quality of his had become more apparent in the last few hours, as they stepped out into the cool Los Angeles air, the bustle of the airport seemed to disappear. In the background, the rush of adrenaline from the encounter was fading, leaving behind a peculiar combination of fatigue and unease. Although she was relieved that it was finally done, she couldn't help but worry about the consequences in the future. What would happen if this happened? Would the airline do what they said they would do, and would their actions really affect on the treatment of people going forward? "I can't stop thinking about it," said, raising an eyebrow, regarding how attentive they seemed to be. "But whether or not they would really shift, or will there just be more small talk?" Her husband glared forward, his mouth clenching. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he thought to himself, ever so slightly. "We have captured their attention, and they now understand that we are committed. But fixing a flawed system requires more than simply making promises, and will ensure that they carry it out. The true test will lie in their level of persistence." She clenched his fist, little more content with his response. Still, a hint of doubt persisted. She wanted to put the ordeal in the past and move on from it all, and she felt the same way about her partner. Pay attention to the thrill of their arrival in Los Angeles, while also considering what may be going on behind the scenes, her thoughts busy with scenarios, investigations, meetings, and the actual task. As they kept on their way to the exit, the question occurred to her. Do you believe it will get more troublesome before it gets better, considering all the chaos we've caused, in your opinion? Her spouse gave her a quick look, but she seemed to be fainting. A little grin forms on his lips as he wonders whether their SM would seize this chance to make a real difference. They attempt to dismiss it, but we will have to deal with it. They aren't happy with how his voice was light, but there was a... She said something under her breath, adding, "I don't know how they'll handle this with Edge." If she feels this way, then he must be thinking that this is the beginning of something far more significant than a traumatic flight. "It's no longer about us," he replied with some contemplation. "Instead, it's about establishing a precedent. It's about preventing a recurrence of this kind of incident, and not just with this airline, but with..." She understood the significance of his remarks and nodded, acknowledging that he was correct. Had become more than simply a romantic relationship. It had become a statement about guaranteeing that other passengers spared itself the ordeal of having to insist that the airline industry admit its tribulations and undertake meaningful transformations. They arrived to the taxi station and met Mr. With the door held open and his hand resting on her shoulder, Porter helped her climb inside, and she took a seat. The battle was far from done, far from over, but for they were now united in their commitment, and it was palpable. That was the deciding factor when the taxi departed the airport and entered the congested streets of Los Angeles. The pregnant lady reclined, her mind wandering to the unknown. She had no idea what to do next or how the airline would handle the situation. Expected a response in the days to come, but she was certain of one thing: they had stood firm. They had persevered through the discomfort of speaking up, even when it seemed like everyone was against them. Their lives, and regardless of what came next, they had already achieved something significant. The future may be cloudy, but they would confront it shoulder to shoulder. After what seemed like an eternity, she finally gave in to the want to feel a fleeting belief that things may be different, that their choices could make a difference, make an influence that will remain, not just for themselves, but for everyone who stood before the city skyline, having experienced unjust treatment, had their dignity disregarded, or had it pushed away standing before them. The expectant mother came to a realization. This wasn't only about reaching Los Angeles. It was about stood up for their principles and would not give up until they achieved the change they desired, regardless of the time it took. The commotion of the day had subsided by the time they arrived to their hotel in downtown Los Angeles, where sparks had taken root. The pregnant lady slumped back in the vehicle, her thoughts running over all that had happened, her tiredness palpable. Her every choice, every statement, every instance, when she had fought for, even though she felt overwhelmed by the weight of it all, she found some solace in the knowledge that she had made the correct choice, had battled for more than just her. She would have been proud of the outcome nonetheless. Was aware that her perspective on life would change. Mr. Porter, who had maintained his composure throughout, seemed exhausted, but his expression remained one of unwavering pride in their accomplishments and her courage in standing up for what she believed in order to make them face the facts. But his thoughts were already planning forward, so he will continue to hold the airline accountable until they demonstrate tangible, long-term improvement. He was determined to make them pay, and he was prepared to go to any lengths to ensure that they were held responsible. As the taxi came up to, he smiled reassuringly and turned to her as he said, "We've done all we can for the day. Now let's take a deep breath. You've worked hard for this," she said with a grin. "Returning but exhausted, I have lost all sense of smell and taste. You will." With a delicate touch, he reached out and touched her hand, saying, "But tonight, that won't work. Tonight it's just the two of us. Tomorrow we'll go back to business as usual, but for now we're taking a vacation." She nodded in appreciation. Notwithstanding her uncertainty about the quality of her sleep, she listened to his remarks. Still, she saw a glimmer of optimism in his delivery, the measured tone of his voice. Perhaps if the airline changed, or if they did what they wanted, everything would turn out the way they had imagined. They got out onto the sidewalk once the taxi driver dumped their bags. The crisp, nighttime air was a welcome relief from the stress they'd been under all day. On that particular day, when they stepped into the hotel lobby, she couldn't help but get a glimpse of the mundane world around her. When things progressed around them, some folks checked in, while others struck up casual conversations, people going about their daily lives oblivious to the tempest that had just swept through her for an instant. She almost wished she could into that realm, where cares didn't matter, and where little issues remained minor. But she was aware that wasn't. The truth was that the conflict they had ignited had far-reaching consequences, and it would need some time to determine whether or not it had a lasting impact. Contrast Mr. Porter, after they were back in their room, pulled back the drapes to provide a view of the metropolitan skyline. When they lingered in the vista, lost in contemplation, the expanse of the metropolis unfolded before them. Despite the dazzling lights in the distance, his focus was squarely on the call he was about to make. He still hadn't finished dealing with the airline when they checked out of the hotel, and neither was she not yet involved. He had begun the argument and had no intention of ending it. For the time being, they gave themselves a little break till they found out. He looked across at his wife, who was already on the bed, arms crossed, and absorbed in sitting gently at her side, he said, "I thought you'd done well. You have stood up for what is right, and no one can take that away from you, no matter what happens from now on." She turned to meet his stare, her eyes betraying their weariness as she found a tranquility inside. Have the fortitude to persevere through difficult times. Without it, I would not have been able to. His grin was real and simple without you. Therefore, there was no need for you to. We're usually on the same page. And this time, she grinned even more. Truthfully, she had a little relief from the knot of tension in her chest. The first time all day, thanks. He leaned in for a gentle kiss on her forehead, thanking her for being there through it all. Voice calm and comforting. "It is my responsibility to stay by your side no matter what, and you are under no need to express my gratitude." Flopped against the cushions, feeling the day's burdens begin to subside. The battle was far from finished, and it never would be. There will be other calls, meetings, and questions to address in the future, but at this very moment, there are none. Had one other, and that was plenty. Tomorrow would bring other difficulties, more roadblocks and more hurdles to overcome, but they were determined to overcome any challenge that came their way as a united front. Despite the world's efforts to derail her today, she held her head up, and she felt she could do the same with his support. Uncertain of what lay ahead, the expectant lady closed her eyes and gave herself permission to relax as the city lights flickered below. Sit back. Even if just for a second, she had no idea what the future contained, but one. It was evident that they were not going to back down. They had already made the first move, and everything else was secondary if you found pleasure in it. For more stories like this, hit that like button, tell us what you think in the comments, and sign up for further accounts similar to this.